I stood in his office as he lit the receipt of my art school deposit like it was nothing but trash. My father ripped the check into pieces, looked at me with a smile that had never belonged to me, and said words I would never forget. "If you choose paint over profit, you are not my daughter." The study smelled like cigar smoke and old leather-bound paper stacked on mahogany shelves. My heart felt like it stopped beating completely. Everything around me seemed to slow down. He slammed the door shut, and the lock clicked like a judge's gavel banging against wood. I stepped out into the rain with my portfolio clutched to my chest, and I whispered, "One day you'll need me," before the city swallowed me whole. I meant every single word I said. I could still feel the weight of that moment, the finality of it all pressing down on my shoulders as I walked away from the only life I had ever known. I crashed on my friend Maya's couch and painted until my fingers cramped and ached from holding the brush so tightly. My sketchbook became louder than the family name I had lost when I left home that day. My mother sent a single text line, "You made your bed." On the television in Maya's living room, a glossy advertisement showed my father at a ribbon-cutting ceremony with his business partners and board members. The man who cut me off was being worshipped by everyone around him like some kind of business king. A news crawl flashed across the screen at the bottom. Company CFO resigns amid liquidity concerns. I stared at the screen and felt the first seed of something dark and necessary take root inside my chest like a plant growing in shadow. Everything was falling apart for him, and a small part of me felt something I didn't want to feel yet. I entered a late-night art contest with one trembling canvas that represented my entire life story. It was all fury and salt, all the pain I couldn't speak out loud to anyone who would listen. A man in the back of the gallery raised his card without any hesitation or second thought. The piece sold for just enough money to pay my share of rent and buy ramen noodles for a month. The buyer refused to be photographed with the artwork, but he scribbled a note on the back of his business card, "You make people feel." For the first time in my life, someone paid for my pain and called it art instead of weakness. A message waited on my phone that very night. "I'd like another piece, betrayal, but pretty." The buyer insisted on complete secrecy, introducing himself as AO over coffee the next morning. He asked only for the truth on canvas, nothing more and nothing less. Over coffee at a small cafe, he slid a business card with a firm I had never heard of and said, "I collect people's second chances." He mentioned my father almost casually, like a man who knew the map of an old kingdom and all its secrets. He offered to pay for a small gallery show for my work. I wanted to say no because something felt wrong about it. The thought of him buying my silence stung like a wound I couldn't ignore no matter how hard I tried to push it away. I posted a painting online and a caption that read, "He tore the check." I tore my fear. It exploded overnight like fireworks lighting up the sky. Strangers wrote long paragraphs about how my work hit home and made them feel understood. People sent me direct messages sharing their own fevered betrayals and painful stories. I became shorthand for anyone who had left a safe path for something real and meaningful. My father's assistant called to demand I take the post down immediately. Her voice was clipped and small on the phone. Instead of backing down like I was supposed to, I planned a solo showcase in a gallery across town. While I rode the wave of comments and likes, I overheard a podcaster mention unusual loans at my father's firm during an interview. "Bridge loans, risky offshore lines," the voice said clearly. A small financial blog dug deeper into a delayed earnings report that hadn't been filed on time. My father, who dismissed me as a starving artist, started using my name in angry phone calls to his lawyers and business partners. AO said nothing about it, but his eyes darted toward headlines whenever they appeared. The next morning, a terse email landed in my inbox. "We're being audited." My Betrayal series went to auction at a prestigious gallery, and AO's entire network pushed the bids higher and higher with each round. The final hammer fell, and a private collector paid far more than anyone expected to pay for art. For the first time in my life, I tasted real money and saw how public attention converts into actual currency that you can hold in your hand. I paid off my debts to Maya and other friends who had helped me. But there was a chill when I realized how easily influence could be bought and sold like a commodity. AO leaned in close and said, "There's a window opening up. Would you go through it with me?" My new gallery invite was for the same hotel where my father's company hosted its investor dinners every month. He wasn't scheduled to attend that night, but his partners were there dressed in expensive suits. I felt like a ghost at a feast watching everything from the edges. In a corner of the ballroom, a lawyer from my father's firm argued with an unknown man about off-balance sheet liabilities. Ao whispered to me, they miscounted the cost of pride. He pressed me to keep painting, to keep the crowd on our side watching my work. I agreed because I wanted my father to see the look on his face when fame found me. Ao slid an encrypted drive across the table and said, "This is why I want you in front of all this." Inside were contracts, sugar-dated invoices, and wire trails that smelled like bribery and quick fixes to save his company. He told me his sister lost a factory because my father had undercut a supplier deliberately. He wanted justice more than profit for himself. I held the drive and felt the scale tip inside my stomach between right and wrong. Expose or exploit the information? He asked quietly, revenge or repair? I couldn't answer him yet because I didn't know what I wanted. Ao laid out a plan: leverage my growing audience, raise a fund from supporters, use public auction and private backing to buy enough shares to shift control of the company. He would front capital if I became the public narrative and face of the movement. I would be the girl who sacrificed dignity for the right reasons. I wrestled with becoming the revenge headline I swore I'd never be in my life. Still, the idea of walking back into my father's life with leverage felt like justice. I signed a simple NDA and the gears began to turn slowly. We staged a soft whistleblower angle during an interview I gave to a major publication. I spoke about artistic truth and freedom of expression, but journalists asked the right follow-up questions that made headlines. Donations started flowing into a fund for artists displaced by corporate greed. The money was small, but symbolic of something bigger. Every headline added pressure on my father's PR team to respond. He called the family in a panic, barking orders to neutralize the coverage immediately. I watched from a cafe as his empire's noise turned to static and confusion. A small financial outlet published a tip about missing liabilities in the company's reports. The stock tumbled 20% in a single day of trading. My father stormed into a meeting and slammed a file across a table, blaming rivals, regulators, and market panic. Not his choices or his mistakes. At home he confronted my mother and spat, "We did everything right." But their board was restless and nervous. Meanwhile, my inbox filled with proposals from activists and investors interested in what we were doing. A former mid-level manager from the company contacted me by direct message and offered to hand over internal emails if we could protect him from retaliation. He told me about being asked to ignore flagged transfers by his supervisors. I met him in a parking lot at night, nervous but determined. His hands shook as he slid a folder my way carefully. Inside, emails, memos, and a payment trail that mapped right to the CEO suite. I tucked the copies into my bag and felt the tilt toward something irreversible and final. A distressed sale was announced. A block of shares the board was forced to liquidate quickly to raise cash. Ao moved quickly, whispering about stealth bids and shell vehicles to use. The auction was messy, with vultures and opportunists circling like predators. We won barely, using a mix of art sale proceeds, Ao's personal capital, and donors who trusted our narrative completely. The purchase registered under an LLC that carried my name as the owner. When the press called, I said nothing to anyone. Legally, I was now in the room where decisions got made. The next morning, a terse letter arrived at the company, notice of transfer and a demand for an emergency shareholder meeting within days. My father read my name aloud in the conference room and looked older than the tabloids ever made him. He belittled the purchase as a parlor trick to impress people, then quietly phoned old allies for support. But the board now had to answer to a shareholder with enough control to call votes and make changes. The first motion? An independent audit of all finances. He smiled with the bite of a cornered man who knew he was trapped. I walked into the boardroom with a single folder and my wallet feeling small but powerful. Microphones rustled and clicked as cameras prepared. The air was thick with tension and uncertainty. Men who once patronized me avoided my eyes like I was someone dangerous. I opened the folder and laid out the audit request with all supporting documentation. Someone called me naive and unprepared. My father stood to speak his defense. For the first time, I heard the tremor behind his anger like fear underneath the noise. We called a press conference and I presented evidence, email chains showing communication about fraud, suspicious transfers to offshore accounts, personal guarantees signed with company letterhead by executives. The cameras flashed like lightning. Journalists leaned forward in their seats hungry for more details. The room split into stunned faces and furious denials from my father's team. My father's legal team promised countersuits and said the documents were forged and unreliable. The proof kicked the door open to everything. But someone filed an injunction to freeze certain accounts that very day. Lawsuits flew back and forth. My father sued for breach of fiduciary duty, claiming the takeover was orchestrated specifically to ruin him personally. My foundation's accounts were temporarily frozen pending litigation that could take months. AO's backers got cold feet and demanded more guarantees in writing before continuing to fund us. I scrambled to keep donors calm and confident, to keep artists paid on schedule, to keep my own head above the noise and confusion. A midnight courier dropped a small key and a note at my door. "There's more in Box 112. Box 112 contained an envelope with my name in my father's handwriting and a failing letter from the art school he refused to pay for years ago. Then a ledger with marked transfers and a receipt with my childhood nickname, Emmy, written in faded ink. There was also a torn page with my first stick figure drawing tucked inside carefully. The ledger tied specific transfers back to vendors who were never paid for goods they delivered. I sat on my floor and wept not for money, but for how small my father thought I was all along. With the ledger and new whistleblower testimony from employees, regulators ramped up their investigations significantly and fast. The board had no choice but to remove executives implicated in the scheme of corruption. Resignations were tendered one by one as people scrambled to protect themselves. The company stabilized under temporary management that actually cared about doing things right. The press began calling the story a family downfall turned corporate expose that captivated everyone. I felt a surge of vindication, but the personal cost was raw and painful. AO leaned in and said bluntly, "We can liquidate divisions, sell the brand, take every penny. He'll be finished completely. It would be thorough, delicious, and absolute in its destruction." For a second, the thought was intoxicating and tempting to consider. I could erase the man who erased me from his life. Instead, I walked through the old factory where families worked and saw the faces of people who would lose their jobs if we burned it down for revenge. I outlined a plan to rebrand the company into a hybrid model. Profitable divisions would continue operating, and profits would seed an arts incubator and community grants for neighborhoods in need. It was a compromise that enraged some shareholders and delighted others who saw the vision. The media called me a visionary and a genius at business. The vultures called me a fool for showing mercy. We launched the incubator with a surprise announcement, a scholarship in my name for kids from neighborhoods the company once displaced unfairly. Months after the takeover stabilized and the incubator flourished with success, I found my father on a park bench, sketching badly with a cheap pen he'd bought somewhere. He looked smaller, hollowed at the edges like life had drained something essential from him. He didn't beg me for anything or ask for forgiveness directly. He only said, "I saw the mural you funded." I didn't know. He pressed a folded scrap of paper into my hand, an apology without signature or formal words attached. I told him forgiveness was a currency I could spend only of my own choice, not his demands. Reconciliation would come later, if ever happened at all between us. We set rules together. He would attend therapy, absence of business dealings with me, a monitored relationship moving forward carefully. He accepted like a child taking medicine he didn't want but needed for health. The press wanted a reunion photo for their stories and ratings. I gave them a small, controlled statement about healing and accountability instead of drama. At the reopening of the company's headquarters, repurposed partly as an arts hall and exhibition space, my painting, Forgiven, hung above the atrium where my father once signed contracts that hurt people. The room filled with people whose lives changed because a disowned artist refused to be silent about injustice. My father stood in the back, eyes wet but steady, watching everything unfold. I spoke about art, power, and mercy, and signed the final check that seeded the foundation for good works. The last line I said, and the one everyone remembered, I didn't save his company to punish him. I saved it to prove we could be better than our mistakes.